Welcome to this Camtasia presentation on the medieval world as precursor to the modern world. In this video, we will do the following. We will talk about medieval Christianity along with political and economic arrangements that accompany that. We will talk about the emergence of the medieval university. We will also talk about the mendicant orders associated with the medieval university. We will talk about the cultural innovations associated with the movement from Romanesque to Gothic architecture, which becomes the dominant form of architecture in the late medieval period. Finally, we will talk about four medieval philosophers that I would like you to have some familiarity with as preludes to the modern philosophy that we will be looking at. As you probably know, the most important institution of the Middle Ages was the church, more specifically the Roman Catholic Church in Western Europe. It owned immense properties and was very rich for most of the Middle Ages period. However, there was a time period in which the church gets into financial difficulties. And during this time period, some of the overarching authority of the church comes unraveled enough that aspects of the modern world will emerge as a result of the financial difficulties of the church. The church, though, was international and really independent of what we might think of as any kind of national authority or oversight. There was centralized orthodoxy in Western Europe, which means that essentially there was an official set of beliefs. And with that in place, there was at least prima facie a unity of faith. The social organization of the Middle Ages is referred to as feudalism. Under the leadership of the church, the social structure of the world was very stable and remained so for centuries. That arrangement of relations that we refer to as feudalism was extraordinarily hierarchically organized. And this cut off social mobility. At least it cut off social mobility in an upward direction. The system allowed for decentralized local control by local vassal nobles, those are lesser nobles, who owed their fealty or loyalty to higher nobility. There is, during this time, no concept yet of sovereignty. Sovereignty meaning the idea that the highest authority is that of the country or the nation or the state. That idea has not yet emerged. And in fact, this will become one of the main features of the modern world, is the emergence of this idea of sovereignty. Most people were peasants, or even worse than peasants, they were serfs. And I would like you to think about serfs in a specific way that will set the stage for a discussion of Marx later in the semester. Serfs are bound to the land that they work, and they are bought and sold with that land. They are not chattel slaves, where chattel indicates some kind of personal property that can be moved about with the person who owns that particular thing. But they are a kind of real slaves, that is, real property slaves, where the idea of real property is that kind of property that is attached to the surface of the earth, land and houses and that kind of thing. And that's what the serfs were. They were bought and sold along with the property, the surface of the land as it was sold. The economic system associated with feudalism is called manoralism. And in manoralism, There are locally independent units that are called manors, and they are supposed to be, or they are thought to have been, more or less self-sufficient. In the center of the manor is the manor house, which is a castle, and the surrounding lands are the lands that support the life of the manor. The manor is where the nobles live, and then the surrounding land is where the peasants live, and they produce everything that is needed for everybody that lives in the manor to survive. There's nothing that impels these people to do much trade, since they are self-sufficient. And since there is no trade, there is little use of money. And without money, there is no finance industry. And charging interest violated church law, so it is universally illegal. And that leaves the medieval world somewhat separated into these independent units that are cut off from each other. We are used to thinking about this period of history as the Dark Ages, as primitive and barbaric. Of course, the people of that time did not think of themselves as belonging to the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. The idea of a Middle Age presupposes the idea of some later age that, of course, these people would have been unaware of. And the idea of the Dark Ages is one that they simply would have denied. They thought of themselves as belonging to an enlightened age. And the reason for that was that they lived in the historic period after Jesus Christ had come into the world. And of course, Jesus Christ is recorded in the scriptures as being the light of the world. And so these people thought of themselves as living in an enlightened age, and they thought of themselves as contrasting to the previous ages before Jesus had come into the world, which they thought of as the Dark Ages. Now, that being said, the idea of a dark age or an age of barbarism is in some ways one that we might think has some truth to it. And the great art historian and commentator Sir Kenneth Clark admits, while looking at great art from the time period and the accomplishments of medieval civilization, he admits that Western civilization made it out of the Middle Ages by the skin of our teeth. He means that, in fact, the Middle Ages were themselves, Middle Age civilization was itself ensconced in barbarism, but barely escaped the onslaught of the northern barbarians, the Norsemen or the Vikings. He discusses, however, a period during the Middle Ages that is called the Great Thaw that began to occur in the 11th and the 12th centuries. And I would like to call your attention to two great enduring legacies of that period: the emergence of the university and the development of Gothic architecture. Our central focus for this class is on philosophy, and we want to point to a transformation of medieval philosophy into modern philosophy. And to do that, we need to look briefly at medieval philosophy and its association with the university. Keep in mind that early modern philosophy is not going to be closely associated with the university, as we will see. Later on, of course, and this is going to spread into our own time, philosophy will again take that association with the university back up. There are three important features of medieval philosophy. The first is, as I mentioned a minute ago, that it is university-centered. The second is that it comes out of the mendicant orders that are associated with the university. And the third is the priority of Aristotle. At the beginning of the modern age, it should be noted, and I'll mention this later again, that Martin Luther will be particularly opposed to the Roman Catholic fixation on Aristotle, and so will all the other early modern philosophers. The university, even as we know it today, is essentially a medieval invention. The world's first university, and that's a representation of this university. The world's first, to the side there, the illustration. The world's first university emerged in Bologna, Italy, in about 1088. Now, we can't be precisely sure because the university emerges out of some previously instituted church schools, but sometime around 1088, the idea of a university got on its feet in Bologna. Universities taught a curriculum that centered on the trivium, that is, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Later, the curriculum adjoined Aristotle's physics and metaphysics to the curriculum of the trivium. The medieval universities established the ranks that we still recognize today, the ranks of a bachelor, master, and a doctor. They also established a scholastic method of dialectical examination that is the basis for the modern academic defense that many of you will experience when you have finished your honors thesis. You will need to defend it. And this ritual of defending your honors thesis is a descendant of the old kind of defense that a master would do in front of the bachelors at a medieval university. They specialized in and promulgated what we know as scholastic philosophy. Now, scholastic philosophy is very complex, but we will boil it down to a kind of philosophy that is going to seek to integrate and harmonize faith with reason. The great medieval universities became associated with the mendicant orders, the Franciscans, especially the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Now, this is going to be adapted as we move into the modern world. In the early modern period, a new mendicant order arises as a result of the Reformation. It is, in fact, an aspect of the Counter-Reformation. And this new mendicant order is that of the Jesuits. And you will be able to recognize a feature of this early modern movement with the Jesuits. The Jesuits are going to become dominant in Roman Catholic education. And you can still see that today in Roman Catholic schools that are named or take an aspect of the founder of the Jesuit mendicant movement, and that is, his name is Ignatius Loyola, and you can see how many Roman Catholic universities are going to have some feature of his name in the name of their universities. The third feature of the university is its close association, its emphasis, I should say, of the philosophy of the classical Greek philosopher Aristotle. During the period of the Great Thaw, the classical writings of Aristotle had become rediscovered when they were transferred back to Europe from Arab sources that had preserved them. No doubt this helped to usher in the Great Thaw. Aristotle's writings were given a scholastic interpretation at the university. Each feature of Aristotle's writings was interpreted, and there came to be an official philosophical criterion with Aristotle as the central figure. Aristotle was so important that he came to be referred to among the scholastics as the philosopher. This photograph to the side is of one of the great medieval universities. It is Oxford University, that was established sometime around 1096, some 8 years after the University of Bologna had been established. This photograph is of Merton Chapel, and it is an example of the other great innovation of the period of the Great Thaw, and that is, it is an example of Gothic architecture. Well, what is a Gothic architecture? Not only had Islamic civilization preserved Aristotle's writings and transferred them back to Europe, it also transferred this important technical innovation, the pointed arch, and you can see that on the right side. And it replaced or superseded the older version of an arch, which was the rounded Romanesque arch in architecture. And here's why that's important. The comparative weakness of round arches is that in order to make them higher, they must be made wider. The width of the arch is the diameter of a circle, and the height of this rounded arch is the radius of the circle of the same circumference. So in order to actually make the circle higher, one has to, that is, increase the radius. One has to almost, at the same time, simultaneously increase the diameter. The round arch can be made into a half-barrel dome. The forces of this dome, however, move outward from their supporting walls. So if you're looking at this, picture this diagram of the dome to the right. You can see the walls that are holding up the dome. Well, there is a force moving outward on either side of those walls that is necessary to hold up this arch. And the higher the vault of this dome is, the more outward force is necessary. The result of this is that Romanesque architecture usually involves thick walls with small openings, and that means that the interior of these churches is going to be quite dark. Here you see the interior of a Romanesque church. Now compare that with this. This is the light flooding into a Gothic-style cathedral, in this case, the Cathedral at Chartres. What allows for that light? Well, in the same span as a round arch, a Gothic pointed arch can be raised infinitely higher. And the forces that are moving outward on the pointed arch can be supported from an exterior support system called blind buttresses. This arrangement allows for large openings that can run between the ribs of a vault from bottom to top. And of course, this allows for much more light, with all the religious and intellectual significance that entails. There are several important philosophers that belong to this period of the Great Thaw. They are covered in detail in the first half of this civilization series, but here they are. I will present them to you very briefly here. The first that we'll mention is Albert the Great. Albert the Great was a great German Dominican. That is to say that he was a member of the Mendicant order called the Dominicans, and he studied at the university, one of the old universities, or the new universities, I guess, because they've just come along recently. One of these universities that is located at Padua in Italy. He was canonized and is recognized as one of the church doctors. And by a church doctor, what it means is that he is one of the premier thinkers who has advanced and solidified and promulgated Roman Catholic theology. Our course text says that he was a man of vast learning and Aristotelian persuasions. He advanced Aristotle's notion of hylomorphism, and this is a technical philosophical word that relates to the idea of forms changing from one form to another while retaining the same matter. And Albert the Great was the teacher of our next figure, Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is the greatest philosopher of this period, and he is certainly one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Thomas takes Roman Catholic theology as it had sat fairly stably since the early medieval philosopher St. Augustine, and he takes that Roman Catholic theology and he synthesizes it with Aristotle's philosophy. And we should remember this again when we talk about Martin Luther. Thomas is perhaps the principal voice of the natural law tradition, and he influences modern political philosophers in this tradition, including the Founding Fathers. Thomas is a very important philosopher. Next we have John Duns Scotus, and unlike Albert and Thomas, John Duns Scotus, John Duns the Scot, entered the Franciscan order. He received the title the Subtle Doctor and was beatified in 1993. On many topics, Duns Scotus is in opposition to Thomas. And so in reading Thomas's work and in reading Duns Scotus's work, there is a kind of debate over issues of theology and theological philosophy. Duns Scotus reinterprets Aristotelian orthodoxy and advances philosophy of language. The final figure that we will talk about is William of Ockham. William of Ockham is the English philosopher responsible for the famous Occam's razor. Like Duns Scotus, he was a Franciscan. He was an important logician and made important advances in logic. But the thing that our text points out about him, and he is the final figure that is discussed in the chapter that ends the medieval period of philosophy in our textbook. The important identifier of William of Ockham is that he resuscitates skepticism based on the assumption of God's omnipotence. In this, our text sees him as a transitory figure to modern philosophy. which is often thought to arise in combination with skepticism, where skepticism is understood as a epistemological doctrine that doubts that knowledge claims can be finally justified. We will see this rise of skepticism has an important and prominent position in the early modern stages of philosophy. And we will see it in Montaigne and Descartes, and in Locke, and in Hume. So that does it for our examination of the medieval precursor to the modern world. We have looked at medieval Christianity and political and economic arrangements. We have examined the medieval university, and we have taken a look a little bit at the mendicant orders that are closely associated with those universities. We have investigated the transition from Romanesque to Gothic architecture, and we have also looked briefly at 4 medieval philosophers: Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, John Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham. Next time, we will look into the modern world. We will look at entry into the modern world with Renaissance humanism, republicanism, the Reformation, the rediscovery of classical skepticism, and the emergence of science. The end.